From the top of the tip. Oh, it's so tall.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Unacceptable Podcast. This is Mila here with Ken, and we have a special guest, Professor Karl Widerquist, who is a political philosopher and an economist at Georgetown University and the co-founder of the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network. He's authored numerous publications on basic income, so today we're going to talk about universal basic income in depth. Last episode, we kind of played with the issue a little bit, but we're gonna take the discussion to another level. So, how's it going, everyone?
Good.
Keeping well during quarantine. So during now, especially because of this quarantine, the coronavirus, I think the discussion of universal basic income has really become more centered, at least in Canada, where we're at right now. We have the government giving out checks to people who are unable to work. And there's been a kind of debate going on where we've been considering the universal basic income. So there's both right-wing and left-wing critiques of this, which we'll go through later. But I'm going to let Karl first go through just some basics. So Karl, I wanted to ask, what first got you into this debate?
Well, there's, I don't know if it's something to be proud of or if it's something to be ashamed of, but I've been interested in basic income since my 15th birthday on February 7th, 1980, when Milton Friedman broadcast his television series Free to Choose, and the episode that aired that night was about the negative income tax, which shares a lot of similarities to basic income. And I've been a supporter of the idea really since then, which gives me, I guess, a lot of cred for long-term involvement in the movement. But it also kind of implies that my political ideas haven't changed in 40 years, but that's not really true. My political ideas have very much developed in those years, but basic income has really become something that has taken a much bigger role in my thinking as I've developed over these years.
Yeah, I think that's something I think about a lot as well, because I think I've had these baseline political views, and as I get older, some of them change, but there's still a sort of fundamental ethic behind them. Interestingly, Milton Friedman had a big impact on my views. I joke that he turned me into a socialist when I read Democracy and Capitalism in my democratic theory class.
Reverse psychology there.
Yeah, there was a little bit of reverse psychology. So what are some adjacent topics that have helped you develop your views on universal basic income?
I'm not sure what you mean by adjacent topics. Could you?
So like, is there an underlying ethical theory or political theory that have sort of influenced your opinion on this issue, which is kind of a largely economic one, but it also intersects with, say, like ethical theory on some levels as well?
Oh, yes. I was raised by lefty Christians who take the egalitarian component of Christianity very seriously, which most Christians today don't. They portray it as if you're poor, it means you haven't prayed enough or you've done the bad things. As long as you hate the right people and you're not gay or a single mother and you say you love Jesus, that's all there is to Christianity. That wasn't the type of theology that I was raised in. I'm still not a Christian, but I was raised in the idea that it was about living these commandments that tell you to be very selfless and giving, and to be on the side of the least advantage. And I take that very seriously. That that justice is about being on the side of the very least advantaged and the most oppressed. And what I find is that all societies are run by some connected group. Even a perfect democracy is going to be run by 51% who are relatively advantaged to at least some of the people who are out of that group. You can have a revolution of the proletariat, but whoever gets in charge is no longer one of this most proletariat disadvantaged groups. They're the new ruling group, and everybody makes biases in their favor. So there's really no such thing as a social contract that we can tell ourselves everybody's a part of this. Those least advantaged people are sharing in this. We're telling ourselves these things. Any right system we create or any social contract idea we get, we're telling this as an excuse to put burdens on the least advantaged people. We might be burdening ourselves in some way either, but we're not really understanding the abused spouse, the homeless person, the person separated from their family at the border. We really don't understand that perspective, and we don't realize how cruel we're being to them. So we are always failing in these things. So what we have to do is really to be over the top in our generosity towards all of the outsiders. That doesn't mean we shouldn't protect ourselves from criminals, but it does mean that we have to be really humane to them, even the people that we're most convinced are the most heinous criminals. And that's one of the reasons that I'm for basic income, is that we can't just set people out of our society. It's not really practical to carve off territories to subgroups, because then the nations just get smaller and smaller, and then they go to wars with each other. But what we can do is to ask asking as little as possible from the people in our society, and then rewarding people. If you want people to do more, you have to reward them more. But the baseline for being a citizen and obeying the rules is you're going to get quite a bit for that. So basic income, humane treatment of all outsiders, including convicted criminals, fits into that.
Yeah, I guess that's very, because the unconditional part is what's so novel about this idea, I think. Usually we're used to things like means testing and stuff like that. And I think we'll get into that later on. So I guess what do you think is the best argument for universal basic income, or how do you persuade people? I think what we want to do is kind of let you make your case here.
Yeah, well, I do not consider myself an expert at persuasion, at selling these ideas. I'm a theorist. I write mostly heavy-duty academic theory. It is political theory, so it's written in plain English, or as much as I can in plain English. So anyone can read it and understand it, but it's difficult going for people that aren't well versed in it. Oh, actually, it's difficult going for people who are well versed in it. I know. I'm a political theorist. I read lots of political theory, and all of it's difficult going. Because it's very exacting arguments. That's what I specialize in. I don't specialize in persuasion. There are other people like Scott Santens, who you might have heard of, who lives here in New Orleans and is very much uses the same sort of theory of basic income as I do. Is very much good at the art of persuasion, as is Bergman in the Netherlands and lots of other people. However, now what I find, to me, so I can't tell you what I think is the most persuasive, but I think the most powerful argument is that the reason that I'm for basic income is that I think it's wrong for anyone to come between anyone else and the resources they need to survive. And that is exactly what we do. We tell ourselves that it's no fault of our own, people are poor, and we're good if we help them, but we're not causing it. Well, of course we're causing it. We are causing it because poverty is a lack of ownership of resources. That's what it means to be poor. in society for the first 200,000 years that humans existed or thereabouts, there was no such thing as poverty. There was difficult life, but everyone had access to the resources they needed to survive. The world was an open commons. People could hunt, they could gather, they could fish, and they could scavenge. They didn't have to ask someone's permission to go out and use the resources of the earth. There are people in the world today who don't have clean water because they can't afford to buy it. There are people who can't grow their own food because all the land is owned by others. They can't hunt and gather. They can't fish because all the rivers are polluted. They can't hunt and gather because all the hunting grounds have been plowed over. They can't farm because all the farmland is taken up by suburban housing or something else. They cannot provide for themselves. So we say, these resources are ours, you can't have them, you're homeless. Your foraging opportunity is scavenging in someone else's garbage. That is the only foraging opportunity. Otherwise, it is beg or it is do what you're told. So we create poverty and then we use it as a threat. The way out of poverty, we say, is work. You got to work. And we don't mean work for yourselves. People have been working for the 200,000 years that the species has existed. But only recently has work become synonymous with paid employment. And that is and no matter how much work do you do and how valuable it is, if you spend your day raising 4 children or caring for a sick relative or going around picking up garbage or doing things for people in need, you don't get money. You get money for doing services for the people who own the property of the world. The very fact of their ownership is what means that you don't have direct ownership to the commons we used to have. So we not only is it wrong, we're not only creating the situation where poverty exists, but we are taking advantage of it. We're using it as a threat to get the disadvantaged people of the world to do what the advantaged people of the world want them to do. It's self-serving and it's wrong.
Yeah, I think, one of the things Ken and I were discussing last week was basically like the less economically empowered one is, the more likely or the easier it is for, say, like predatory bosses to take advantage of say their laborers because they know that they need this income a lot more to survive. So when you're advocating for a UBI, do you is there a specific number or amount that you advocate for, and how did you come to that figure?
Well, I have sort of given up trying to have a dollar figure at my fingertips because it changes every year.
Yeah.
Due to inflation and economic growth, and you can't keep up. So what I talk about in an academic paper that I wrote almost 10 years ago called The Physical Basis of Voluntary Trade is to put people, you want to get the minimum, basic income should be at least the minimum where you are entering the market economy and society in general as a free person who's entering because the positive rewards are good, not because you're desperate and you have to. The main things people have to do to get property in the world today are get a job working for someone who has property or marry somebody who has property. Neither of those things are things that people should do because they are desperate for the resources they need to survive and thrive. So what I argue is it needs to be enough for food, shelter, clothing, at least basic transportation, not for, you don't necessarily need the freedom to jet off to Sydney twice a year or anything like that, but to get around your community where you're going to have contacts, yes. Food, shelter, clothing, so basic transportation. If medical care is not free, it's got to be enough for medical care and things like that. And then a cushion to make sure for the other things that people pursue in order to start projects and make their life meaningful. So if you see that people have enough for these things, but they're also exhibit other signs of desperate, then you know that the cushion is too small. That's how I talk about going about finding it. I think the poverty measure in the U.S. is a very poor measure of that. We need a better poverty measure, but that is not a research avenue that I've looked into. Well, what would be the ideal poverty measure? Someone should do a much better one for the U.S.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking of that because, and I guess you kind of answered it, is just because I think one of the critiques of UBI is that it wouldn't sort of keep up with things like inflation. So some people have argued for a federal jobs guarantee instead of the UBI, or some have argued for it in accordance with UBI. I'd be interested to hear what you think of that, like a federal jobs guarantee versus the UBI.
There's no reason why basic income can't keep up with inflation. Just make sure you know what inflation is, and that and you know what the growth rate in the economy are, and you make sure that basic income keeps up with both of them. That's perfectly easy to do. And now, when you pay people a basic income, that's going to create inflationary pressure. But when you tax people, that creates deflationary pressure that counteracts the inflationary pressure. The basic income well-resourced basic income system does not need to add in inflationary pressure into the system. So that's not an issue. The question about a guaranteed job is that it is. If you add that to a basic income system, I don't have a big complaint about it. Now, you could say, well, you could, whatever money you're spending on the guaranteed job, maybe you should use that for higher basic income. Yeah, maybe you should. But in principle, I don't have anything against a guaranteed job. What I am against is means testing. This idea that people need to prove it is that if you don't do your job, then you ought to be in poverty. That is self-serving and ultimately self-defeating idea that the upper class has been selling the middle class for the last several centuries. It's a horrible idea. And it doesn't just, and they sell it to the middle class. So you're the good people. Oh, you work. You're the good people. And it's those bad people who don't want to work who are the big drag on the system. It's not us, the people who just own stuff and get paid for owning things. We're not the problem. So bad people who don't want to work. Well, a lot of people who own stuff don't work. And even if they do work, most of their money is still coming from the stuff they own. The most important income is not from what you do, it's from what you own. Now, and we're all working for, we're not all working for each other as workers. The system is structured so all workers are working for property. We're all working to get a hold of property, and we have to go to the people who own the existing assets in our world to do that. The rentiers of the world. We're all working for the rentiers. And it is self-defeating to put all the workers in a position where we need to test you and our test, we have this, what makes you a worthy person? Do you work for rentiers? Well, that's an awfully self-serving idea of what it means to prove your worth. But also, this idea is self-defeating for the middle class because it puts them in the same position. Middle-class people cannot just most middle-class people who are not nearing retirement age cannot afford to stop working and live off their assets. If they were, we'd call them independently wealthy. We wouldn't call them middle class. Most people can't stop working, and therefore, they have very little leverage to command higher wages. The lack of a basic income, the market power problem that this creates goes way, way up into the middle class. We don't even know how far. If we give the power to say no to everyone by making sure they're compensated for the fact that they can't just go work for themselves because the commons is closed, that gives every single person who has to work for a living, from the poorest person to the wealthiest person, or to the highest salaried person who's not yet wealthy, all of those people, it gives them greater leverage to command better wages versus the people who get paid for owning stuff. And a guaranteed job doesn't do anything to change that situation. You set a wage, everybody gets the guaranteed job at that wage. And it does give you, if I don't like private sector wages, I can go to this job, but it's only as good as this job is. And it maintains this idea that all of us have to prove our existence. All of us have to prove our existence by working for rentiers. And that's no way to structure a society. That's not a society based on voluntary trade, where everybody participates because they want to, not because they have to.
So would I be in, it sounds like would you say that you see UBI almost as a transitionary idea? Because it sounds like you are criticizing the way society is set up, and then and you would like UBI to empower people to, is there something after UBI that you would see as like a good way to set up society? Does that question make sense?
I don't know.
Yeah.
There are people who, it's funny how much people fight over vague terms. Socialism, as far as I'm concerned, the debate on socialism versus capitalism is the debate of vagueness against vagueness. It is the people on one side of the debate define those terms very differently than people on the other side of the debate, and even the people on the same side are dividing these things very way. Like, well, we got to get rid of capitalism, which sounds to people who are for capitalism. So there will be no money, and there'll be just sharing, and there'll be no organization. You know, what is it? What do these things? What do these things mean? What does it mean to move beyond capitalism? Now, if you define capitalism as a system where the worker has nothing to sell but their labor, and they are compelled by that need to go out and work for rentier owners, then basic income itself, then it already destroys capitalism. Then capitalism doesn't exist. But if you define it as a system where people privately own the means of production and have great control over them, it allows that to continue. However, that's where the taxes ought to become. So you're greatly reducing the power of these people. How much you have to reduce, you're reducing it directly by taxing it and creating the base income, and reducing it again then by giving all the workers in society greater leverage. What that's going to do to the system just in and of itself, I don't know. I also think we need better protections for the environment and better management of resources as the people's endowment, rather than as just up for grabs for whoever wants to become a rentier. But that doesn't mean that private ownership and markets don't exist anymore. I don't know. Does that make? I mean, that's a very different market system. Do you want to call that capitalism? It's just this really vague term. You can certainly still have markets. You can even have a lot of private ownership, but the private owners need to pay their taxes and follow their regulations and accept the fact that we're going to have enormously large nature reserves and large common spaces that aren't privately owned. And then we're going to have some public things, such as such as a national health service, and we're going to have and if Amazon, if we can't create a situation where Amazon has real competitors, then we have to give the users of Amazon some control over that corporation and give it some elements of a user's cooperative, which I think is far more important than a workers' cooperative, especially if you have a basic income in place. Now, but those reforms, I don't specialize in. A few maybe, but not in a big way. A big, broad, say this is exactly how we should do it, that I don't know. But a framework for looking at the resources of the earth as the people's endowment, and we only privatize them if that is initially profitable to the people, taking into account the environmental loss, of privatizing them and the other losses that it can't be used as a commons or something, take into account those and how much the prospective rentier is willing to pay, that sort of trade is how we need to do it. That sort of thing is what I envision. But I'm more specializing in this idea that we need to create a situation where everyone is free to have a power to say no to a work or a marriage or some other situation that they might do just because they financially need to. And as Bertrand Russell said, and when he outlined basic income without naming it in 1960, he said, on this basis, we can build further. It's not the end of social justice. And what we're going to need to do next, I don't always know. But the transformative effect of just doing this is very big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And Russell is honestly, like, I maintain one of the biggest geniuses of our time. But yeah, I think that's an issue too. I mean, spending time among socialists, I don't think socialists have come to a consensus about what socialism is either. And there's kind of also a disconnect between the way we theorize about it versus how are we going to right now mitigate the damages of, say, what we call a capitalist system. So I think, yeah, like basic income is one of those things. I know in the US right now, there's a fight for universal health care. In Canada, that's something we've just taken for granted, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, no one said that, for instance, the fight for universal health care is the be-all, end-all of giving people a dignified life, but it's definitely something that you could make the case would make people better off. And I think that's kind of an important element of the basic income debate as well. I was thinking of certain objections that I've seen from people. And one of the ones that I hear the most just from the average person, not from, say, political theorists or anything like that, is I think they conceive of this project, and I've seen this debate as well when it comes to the checks that the government's been giving us during this quarantine time, is they kind of envision someone saying, okay, well, I'm getting a check anyway, so I don't think I'm going to work because I don't want to work. I want to just like sit on the couch and like take my money and do what I want with it. And they're saying, if you don't have that threat, then you're not going to be a productive member of society. And so therefore you're incentivizing people to not work. And then the people who are working are going to be paying for their lifestyle. I think that's the most common objection I've heard from just the average person around here. So how would you respond to that?
Well, they're thinking that, there's a lot of things that go into a response to that. Is that, first of all, they're thinking work is a duty rather than as an opportunity. Nobody, the people who own the stuff are not entitled to people's labor. And they're also thinking of basic income, and because it's a universal payment, they're thinking of it as something created by other people and then given to you for nothing. But despite the fact that basic income is a universal payment where you don't have to do anything to get it, it is the furthest thing from something nothing. It's the furthest thing from undeserved. Because we're not paying people for what they're doing. We're not paying them for a job. We're paying them for what we are doing to them. Is that we're making all kinds of rules that are favorable to advantaged people and imposing these rules on them. The ownership of all the resources has already been given to something else. Thousands of years, people have been privatizing the earth and paid nothing for it. Property owners say, I bought my property. They paid the other property owners. But what is property? Property is a duty on the part of the rest of the world. Is that if I say this land is my land and it is not your land, I am putting you under a duty to not use this piece of land or anything that I make out of it. I am imposing a duty on you. If you impose a duty on someone, impose an obligation on someone, you need to pay for that. So all the resources that have been privatized should be rented And that rent should go back to other people. You deserve that for what was imposed on you, but we haven't just imposed the fact that other people own stuff and you don't, but all of the government's rules. Every law is imposed on you without necessarily your consent. We have these sort of democratic-like systems where people have some input into making the laws, but universality is impossible. We'll never get universal agreement to anything. And although some of our laws, clearly good laws like don't murder, not all of our laws are like that. And even our enforcement of laws like don't murder is really unfair. It favors advantaged people. If you're an advantaged person, you're much less likely to be killed than a disadvantaged person. The person who kills you is more likely to spend greater time in jail. You're much less likely to be falsely accused. And much less likely to be killed by someone who suspects you of murder. There's a lot of things connected to our murder laws that give us reason why we ought to be giving things back to people. So if people don't want to work, if people want to just take that compensation and sit out and not do a job, that's their problem. That's their problem. That's their prerogative. They can do that if they want to. If they don't want to work, if the jobs don't pay them enough, that is the problem for employers. We have an incentive problem in this country that we're not dealing with. And that incentive problem is that employers don't have enough incentive to pay good wages. Because when you have this mentality that we're going to threaten everyone with deep poverty unless they work, then we give employers a great incentive to pay really low wages. Once you get all these people on the couch and not working and say, well, you make it worth my while and then I'll go work. I've already got this basic income. You give me something on top of that to make it worthwhile, then you give employers an incentive to give good wages. And if I'm a worker, I should be happy. The more people who do that, the better I can command higher wages. I'm the guy who wants to work. All right, how much you going to pay me? There's a lot of us sitting on the couch. How much you going to pay me? The worst thing you can do for a worker is to put them in a position where they have no other choice but then to take jobs. The best thing that you can do for them is to make sure they have the power to say no to wages and working conditions that don't work for them.
So this is a really fascinating twist on a very common trope, because usually this burden is placed on the worker to work, and you're kind of reversing that and putting that on the employer. You're saying the onus is on you to offer me a livable wage. Am I characterizing that?
Yeah, correct? That's right. I mean, a person who has no other choice but to work is a slave. And when you have a system where all of the resources are owned by a small number of people, and then everybody else has to work, and by work we mean take paid employment for these people who own all the resources, what you have is slavery with a choice of masters. Now, slavery with a choice of masters is a hell of a lot better than chattel slavery where your master can buy and sell you. But it's not full freedom either. And slaves knew that. When the Civil War ended, Sherman talked to some former slaves and said, what do you need to maintain your freedom? And they said, a spokesman, Garrison Frazier, answer that question. We need land so we can till it and turn it with our own efforts. And he said that because he knew that if the freed slaves had nothing else, they would have to work for their former masters, they would have those crap jobs. And that's what they got. And that's the position that former slaves have been in our country largely ever since. A few have made it out and most haven't.
Yeah. So that makes me, I know that the movement for Black Lives has endorsed universal basic income as a means of reparations for descendants of slaves. And then the reparations are to be paid by, typically the notion is that the reparations would be paid by people who are descendants of slave owners or by the state. So with a universal basic income, what would be your take on that, on reparations in that respect?
Yeah, I support reparations for slavery, and there is one politician, James Felton Keith the second, who is running for Congress to represent a district in Harlem, who is running on basic income and with a connection to reparations for slavery. In what I've said so far, I actually connect it with reparations for loss of access to commons for the colonial movement and the enclosure movement, which established a property rights system that was an elite system where the rich people own everything and everybody else works for them. And we tell ourselves that it's all great and free because a tiny sliver of the people from the bottom make it up into the ownership group. Now, I'm portraying it mostly as reparations for those things which affected everyone on Earth. Now, people are also owed reparations for things that affect just particular people. And in the United States, that is going to be not just African Americans. Really, the reparations movement cannot forget Native Americans. I mean, Native Americans have had things just as bad as slaves. There's different ways. It's different kinds of oppression, different things, but it's not about who had it worse. It's not a competition. It's about redress. And it's not really, none of these reparations are really about things that happened hundreds of years ago. We closed the commons hundreds of years ago, but every day ongoing, we maintain this elite ownership system where we don't all share in the property system that we make out of it. That's really what the basic income is for, not something that happened hundreds of years ago, what is happening today. Now, if in 1865, when the slavery finally ended, if we'd have been a truly great racially repairing society since then, and everything was fair, there would be no talk of reparations. In the same way that that British people are not constantly going to Rome to ask for compensation for the Roman Empire's 400-year occupation of Britain. Okay, that's a long time ago. There's no ongoing exploitation of Britons by Italians. That's all long gone forgotten. What really reparations for slavery is reparations for a racist society. And white people are not ready to admit that we have a racist society. A lot of white people are still in this mentality that we have two races that don't get along, and that's the problem. No, we do not have two races that don't get along. We have a system of racial oppression that advantages one group at the expense of several other groups. And this needs to be redressed. And redress means changing the institutions to change those things. But it also means to say, look, you have inherited a series of disadvantages that affect your welfare and your financial well-being, and that benefit the financial well-being of others. And we need to say I'm sorry, and the way we say I'm sorry in our culture is with money in part. One of the reasons you don't get apologies more often is people are going to think they'll be liable if they actually admit to wrongdoing and say I'm sorry. So money has to be a part of saying I'm sorry, but also sitting down, listening, saying we are sorry, and listening, what do we need to do to change the system? All of those things have to be part of reparations. Now, how to work this in with a basic income, I don't know. I haven't researched that, but I know that we have to listen to the groups and what they're asking for. We need to listen to Native American groups, to the reparations movement, and to other people who are pressing for redress of their grievances. Listen to what they say, negotiate them, and come down with a real settlement.
Yeah, I think I see that a lot in Canada. as well. We have, a terrible history with Indigenous Canadians. And right now, we have a liberal government, but a lot of it's very sort of performative without that sort of material effort that's being put in. So it's kind of like you have a ton of performative land acknowledgements and like the prime minister crying and saying sorry, but we don't really have financial redress yet to sort of deal with that issue. And I think that's kind of the state that a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of liberal politics is in right now, is like there's the performance of the apology without the material redress.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to objections of to UBI. I brought up the disincentivizing work thing. What you're talking about when you were talking about property, it's kind of like an anti-Lockean perspective almost, which is very counterintuitive to, say, Americans, because I find that Lockean philosophy is very underneath a lot of US assumptions about the economy and property especially. So some people might say, you take a look at property, you pay for what property you own. Maybe, someone might contend you don't have the right to hold resources or block them without paying them back. But let's say you're debating with a Lockean proprietarian. But I went on a website, and during my research, it was like proprietarians.com. It was a little bit outrageous, but they are people that you have to win over, right? And so they might view this issue as unjustly coercive. So they're saying look, it's my property. You cannot infringe on my possessions, you commie, how dare you, kind of thing. So how would you, if you don't, or how would you engage them?
I do. As a matter of fact, I've written several books on this issue. So as a matter of fact, I would say most of my arguments are addressed not at Rawlsians, not at conventional liberal egalitarians, and not at socialists, but at this Lockean proprietarian idea.
Mm-hmm.
So my, where to begin? My 2013 book, Freedom is the Power to Say No, talks about the property rights system, how it is structured in a way that makes it impossible for some people really to be truly free people, to have the physical basis necessary to enter in economic interactions with other people as a free person. So I argue on that basis. And that is where I'm building up my own theory of freedom. And it is as much a negative theory of freedom as anything else, because people who have the right access to resources and people who have the right skills don't need anybody's help to have the kind of freedom I'm talking about. All they need is other people to step back and let them do it. And we do not. We interfere with them and coerce them. Now, then I have 2 books and several articles attacking this Lockean perspective that are called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. That's the full title of the first book. The second book is The Prehistory of Private Property, which the Prehistoric Myths book 2. Now, in the first book, we address this idea that we call the Hobbesian Hypothesis. And there's a principle in most Lockean theories, but also in most social contract theories as well, is that the property rights system has to be everyone's advantage. So this proviso must be fulfilled, that I can appropriate property. If I appropriate property, it's mine, but the system that comes out of it has to be the one that's good for everybody. And social contract theorists say, well, you can impose a government on people as long as it's good for them relative to what comes before. And what they do to tell ourselves, what they do is they both then say, well, what came before was terrible. Look at those naked savages. Look at how horrible it is. And Hobbes, the originator of social contract theory, and Locke, the originator of natural property rights theory, at least the modern originator of it, both read colonial accounts of native peoples and who talked about these warlike native savages and how horrible they had it, and said, look, you don't want to be like them. The civilized, the lowest civilized man is way better off than Locke has an argument about how a day labor in Britain in the late 1600s was better than a Native American, the absolute master of thousands of naked savages. Completely false. It's based on nothing but the prejudices of colonialists who were going and stealing land from people. And sure, they wanted to tell themselves that these were warlike savages, that they weren't really great people that they were attacking. It is simply not true. And it's a self-serving assumption again. It's that part of that self-serving bias that all families have. It's reasonable, really, social contracts fulfilled. Our government, it's not completely fair, but everybody gets this baseline thing where it's generally in your interest. Our property rights system, maybe it's not completely fair, but even those without, they get these great job opportunities. They're going to make them way better off than those naked savages. It is false. If you are at the bottom of our economic system, if you are a homeless person, you are better off being one of those surviving Andaman Islanders than you are being a homeless person in the United States today. We have not lived up to these promises. That promise of our system is not fulfilled, and so that sinks social contract theory and any private property system that contains this Lockean proviso. Now, that's the first book. That's Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. And that's not just, and we do this with real evidence. These people who write this stuff, the provisos are fulfilled, they make that stuff up. They have no research. And they portray it like it's obvious. Like, it's obvious day laborers in Britons in 1600s were way better off than those uncivilized naked savages. And they had no research. And people have been repeating that for hundreds of years with no research. So I teamed up with an anthropologist, Grant McCall at Tulane University. We did the research. And we have references to hundreds of anthropological accounts and actually look at just how poor are the poorest people in society and just how bad off are people in native societies. And people in native societies don't live well. Indigenous societies that are really outside of the property rights system do not live well. They have a low life expectancy and difficult lives to lead. But the thing is that's a really low bar for our society. The real injustice in our society is we set this extremely low bar, then we don't even look to find out that we're failing to go up. We just congratulate ourselves for jumping over this low bar that we haven't even bothered to check that we utterly failed to jump over. So we set our own low standards and we fail on them. That's a great tragedy of our society. Now, the second book looks at 3 other prehistoric myths. Those are the myth that equality is impossible, and the myth that capitalism is the best system at promoting negative liberty, and the myth that there's something natural about the property rights system, that if you have a principle of appropriation, then people are going to create a private property rights system. And none of these things, if you look at the anthropology of them, are they true? There are societies that maintain very high levels of both negative liberty and freedom, and the people in those societies are freer than the least advantaged people in the United States today. And they're more equal in their societies. They're not necessarily living well, but they are freer. And equality is possible, greater democracy is possible if you look at what's going on in anthropology. Now, this idea that property is somehow natural to do with, if it is natural, if it is really true that principles of appropriation and voluntary transfer that proprietarians have been talking about for centuries are really make property natural, and that these taxations and regulations that we have and redistribution that we impose on property is unnatural. And then you should see that in the history of property, you should see continuously thwarted attempts to create an individualist private property system. And when you look, as we have, and as the people who make these arguments have not, because we've looked at their arguments, the history of the origin and development of the private property rights system, what you see is a lot of communal-based property, where people create commons. They recognize that whatever system we have, people are going to have access to the commons. If it's a hunting and gathering community, you have the entire land is open, people go out and hunt and gather and very often share what they find, at least with whoever's camping together. If you have an agrarian community, then usually people are entitled to a certain amount of access to farmland and access to hunting and gathering land on top of that, but not to any specific plot. And that they also regulate what other people can do. They look at, well, if you do too much of this, that's going to deplete the soil fertility and be bad for all of us. You can't do that. The people who are closest to original appropriation do not establish these really individualistic institutions that property rights advocates say are natural. And these sorts of communal types of institutions developed all over the world, and they were destroyed by the twin movements of the enclosure movement in Europe and the colonial movement around Europe. And these are going on at the same time that Locke and Hobbes and Thomas More and William Blackstone and Adam Smith and a lot of other people were writing, so talking about how natural these institutions are. And what they were doing was they weren't writing about the system we have. Locke knew that the enclosure movement was destroying communal property at the time that he was writing about how natural private ownership was. Private ownership was being created arbitrarily by acts of Parliament at the time. So what they were doing was very much a propagandistic role, and it's simply false. There is no natural right to private property. Private property are things that governments create. Is a thing that government creates arbitrarily. It can do so for good reasons and for bad. So if we're going to create a property rights system, it has to be one that's fair to everybody. That if we're going to privatize property and give some to you, you've got to be giving something back that's going to profit, not just someday maybe get a job for some poor person, that is going to profit all the people that you're imposing the duty to respect your ownership of that profit. You're imposing this duty on them. You got to pay for that duty. That is, and you're going to obey the regulations because we live in an environment, and the days when you could think of unused land as wasteland, as Locke did, we're never here. And the problem of that is becoming really apparent. We have to have environmental regulations to protect us all from the destruction of the environment that the ownership system is doing right now. And you can't blame it just on the ownership system, because North Korea, with a royal ownership system that calls itself communist, but it's really just a royal system, they're destroying their environment as fast as we are. So it's elitist systems, whether they're private elitist or whether they're centralized elitist, like you had in the Soviet Union. It's these elite systems that are the problem. We have to have a non-elite system, and environmental and other kinds of regulations that are really going to make sure that the system works for everybody.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think, especially, I'm always averse to arguments that sort of appeal to nature to make a point, because there's always these really wild logical leaps that seem to exist. Like, you're kind of insinuating a system is natural without really, like, there's always a jump between saying, this is how nature is, and then this is how we have to live. It always seems logically falsy to me. So I think colonialism is one of the best examples of that. And honestly, I think, and I've written articles about this as well, and that there's these sorts of justifications used for colonialism that are now being used for imperialism abroad, which is also environmentally destructive as well. And they kind of rely on these notions that these societies would be better off if we were to go and impose our democracies on them, whatever that means. Yeah. And so yeah, I totally get that.
No, that was really coherent, and you've strengthened my support of UBI.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah. I remember I was introduced to the idea of UBI because a coworker mentioned Andrew Yang's campaign, and at first I was like, that's ridiculous. Yeah, and then I looked into it and I was like, oh, actually that's, I guess what was attractive to me, it seemed like the most efficient form of social redress. Like, no, wealth wouldn't be destroyed in bureaucracy, wealth wouldn't be destroyed in discriminatory means testing, stuff like that. I was wondering if you had any comments or criticism of Andrew Yang's campaign, and if you paid attention to that at all.
Well, I met Andrew Yang once very early on in his campaign when he was speaking full, a room with a capacity of, I don't know, maybe 40 people were there, and the place was, capacity for 80, or whether 40, or capacity was 20, 40, there were 20, it was like half full, a huge thing. He was new, and he was a really nice guy, really level-headed, and he knew my stuff, and he knew other people in the movement, and of course, and he just said, he quoted me. I mean, some guy you're running for president of the United States, you're going to show a picture of me, with a quote by me, and you think that's going to help. Okay, that's what you want. Now, it's very hard for me not to endorse, if somebody endorses me, hard for me not to endorse them back, especially if they're a smart, level-headed guy, which he turns out to be. And so I followed his campaign, and there's a lot of great things about the campaign. And his program, I read and reviewed his book and gave it a positive review. However, his basic income was too small, and it made one really enormous mistake, which was leaving out children. If you leave out children, you are leaving out the poorest demographic in the United States, which is single mothers and their children. So a single mother with 3 kids gets the same $12,000 a year minus the value-added tax that every other individual gets, and they're supposed to live on that. Now, it is true that most single-parent families in that situation are worse off than that right now. Not all of them are. If you add up welfare benefits that people are eligible for, sometimes you're considerably better off than that. And Yang he was saying you have the option to keep that. But the basic income itself wasn't good enough for that group. And you got to realize what the basic income is for. I mean, it is more for the least advantaged. And the worst thing you can do to a human being is to have them grow up in poverty. That costs them and everyone else for the rest of their lives. There's no amount of money that you can give a person in adulthood that will make up for growing up in poverty. Some lucky people, they get up and thrive. But if you look at how people who grow up in poverty do throughout their lives, no matter what good fortunes come on them, you'll find they do worse in every category. The people who become that thrilling novelist or something after this horribly deprived childhood, those are very rare. We know about them because they're rare. So he didn't do enough for the least advantaged in that. And that I think was the biggest drawback of his campaign. And, he did that. What he told me is he needed a program that was costed out, and this was. Mm-hmm. And he went with a system, and he knows this was his starting point. I think just about everybody in the Yang Gang really wants something bigger than that. And the basic income movement is made up almost entirely people who want something much larger than that, and that includes children. So I think he's coming around to that, and I think he's a really good guy, and he's going to do good things in the coming years. And what he did for the movement, raising the profile of basic income, not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Yeah.
Because people still pay attention to the U.S. I don't know why, but people still do outside the U.S.
That's us. I mean, we're not American. The reason why I do is because a lot of my politics focus on war. And so if you're focusing on war, especially for me, I do a lot on war in the Middle East. Yeah. I find that if I'm studying on war in the Middle East, America is like the center of every analysis when it comes to that. So when I was looking at this campaign season, I leaned Bernie just because I thought he had the best foreign policy. But I was very interested in Yang's campaign as well. One issue I had that with his framework is something you kind of mentioned, where you have the option to keep your sort of welfare payments and stuff like that, or disability checks or something in that regard, or you get the basic income check. So you kind of have to do the math and decide. But then, like, let's say there's someone like, you know, me, I'm not on any sort of financial assistance except for, you know, the stipend from his university, right? But like from the government. So let's say, like, then the people who are better off, who don't need to worry about their social services or the other checks they would get from these things, they get these payments regardless. Plus, they don't rely on other assistance programs. And then these other people, they would have to choose between these programs and, say, their basic income check. So they're the ones that there's a burden on them to sort of like do the math and decide. So then I feel like that would still advantage me, for instance, in that respect, unfairly, perhaps.
I don't think it advantages anybody, because those things are so cumbersome and complex, and they create this poverty trap that makes it really, really hard to get it. So the people who are most stuck because of the poverty trap, you're keeping them stuck with this plan. And then kids growing up in poverty have that great burden to live with their whole life. That burdens the rest of society. There's really no advantage to society of putting people in a poverty trap where they actually, it costs them money to get a job, and it costs them money to move up. That's not good for anybody. We do it because we think punish. You're poor, you need to be punished. That's the way we look at it. We do it because we think it's good for us. But a lot of the things that a lot of our self-serving ideas are really ultimately self-defeating. Is a lot of this punish the poor actually harms the middle class, because it puts a whip to us. Every time we punish those worse off than us, we're putting a whip to ourselves.
Yeah. So then I guess, like, what I'd be wondering is, would you support, say, replacing social welfare programming with a UBI, or would you say that they should be supplemented with a UBI?
If the UBI is, the higher UBI gets, the more things you can replace with it. If you've got a really low UBI, it's better off not to replace anything. Even if you got one it's like higher than food stamps. Well, if it's not enough to live on, you're better off you get that and food stamps. Right. But but at some point, I don't know what the maximum Social Security benefit is. Let's say it's $20,000, and say it's $20,000. I don't know what it is. Say it's $20,000. So that's $40,000 for a couple. And let's say the basic income is also $20,000. Well, it's not necessarily think that the idea is to get that couple a raise from $40,000 to $80,000 a year, plus whatever asset income they might have. That's not necessarily what we need to do, and not necessarily where the money is best spent. What you can do is if if it's high enough, you can start to really cancel some things. If you've got a $20,000 a year basic income for adults and $10,000 for children, you can certainly cancel food stamps. And you can cancel a lot of other things. And if you combine that with a system that addresses how unfair our housing situation is and how that drives up rents, which has to do with a lot of complex things, including zoning laws, but also including the way we let concentration of ownership happen and we don't tax land value and a lot of other things. You address those things, get the price of housing down and give people incentive to rent to this market and to rent quality stuff to this market, get those things, and then you can end a lot of things, maybe like housing benefits, or improve them. Now, but until then, until you get a really high, but there's going to have to be some things that are add-ons. There's some things you cannot replace and can never replace, okay? It shouldn't be that if I become say I'm living on the basic income, I got, $20,000 a year, it's very good basic income, $20,000 a year, and I become a paraplegic, okay? I shouldn't have to buy my own wheelchair out of my basic income. Oh, go buy yourself a $2,000 basic income. You got your $20,000 basic income, go spend that on a wheelchair, on a really nice wheelchair, suck it up. No, it shouldn't work that way. I have a special need. We got to be taking care of that. We're not taking it out of the basic. So some things you'll never replace. So I haven't looked about what is a line-by-line checklist of what we can and cannot replace. And I haven't looked at that. But the general idea is the higher it is, the more you can replace with some things you can never replace.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers, because I think that's what a lot of people are worried about. They're sort of worried about replacing these sort of essential programs with this sort of this check. And I think that appeals to a lot of libertarians, for instance, because like the libertarians I know that do support UBI, they do so because it would eliminate a lot of these social welfare programs.
And it's what people always want to try to characterize it as: poor people versus poor people. They want to say, oh, they want to take away your housing benefit. Say you're in San Francisco or New York and you've got a big housing benefit that might have a cash value of over $30,000 a year. They want to take that away and give you a $12,000 a year basic income. No, it's not what anybody in the basic income movement wants to do. If we get it high enough or combine it with housing policy so you don't need that, then we would get rid of that. But only if something better is in place, and otherwise the basic income is going to be maybe a partial add-on to that. Maybe if you've got a $30,000 benefit, and you say, okay, well, 5,000 out of this 20,000 basic income was supposed to go for rent, so you'll only get 15. Since you get this housing benefit, you only get 15 instead of the 20. Something like that you might get. Those kind of things for working it in with the existing system we would do. But it's not about making some poor get less so that other poor people can have more. It is about a much more generous system where we tax the rentier class, the people who are living off their assets, and other really big high income and high wealth holders. Tax this group because they have benefited enormously from economic growth in the last 50 years that the rest of us haven't shared. It's about taking the benefits of all that economic growth that that tiny sliver of people have benefited from and sharing that out with everybody. So it's about taxing the most able to share with all the poor. So there's going to be add-ons for the existing system. It's not about robbing these other policies to pay for basic income.
Yeah, I think that addresses especially a lot of the left's concerns with basic income. I know a lot of people are hesitant to go on board because of that. Especially, I mean, we kind of talked about, Ken and I kind of talked about this last week. Like, I think certain things, and again, this would apply more to Canada than the US, but certain things like, say, our healthcare system, I think should not just be thrown out the window for like a basic income, for instance, which I think would some people argue for. Mm-hmm. So I think...
Can I go back to the single mother example that you were talking about a UBI for the children? Yeah. That's a really good point that I actually hadn't considered. Just what about the crazy idea of giving minors a universal basic income? Is that ever discussed?
Oh yeah, most basic income plans include a basic income. The children get the basic income. In some, the children get the same as everybody else. In others, the children get less, usually half.
But the children personally get it, not their guardian, is what I was saying.
It's always a question of, it is okay to be paternalistic with children. The problem with paternalism is one adult being paternalistic with another adult is usually not a good idea. But children need somebody to be paternalistic with them. However, exactly when they can control most of their own stuff and gradually get the ability to do that is tough. And you can give it to the wrong person. You know, there are times where parents neglect their children, whether they have a job or they're living off of benefits. They can neglect their children, and a lot of very wealthy families have a parent who hoards all the money, and the children and the other parent don't get stuff. So you need to, for the most part, you're going to need to make sure that the custodial parent has it, and you need some sort of some sort of social system set up that if you do have a neglectful parent, that you have a system in place to make sure that that parent stops neglecting those kids, or those kids get some kind of aid. But you can't, give a 3-year-old, you can't give a 3-year-old $1,000 a month.
I find that very, maybe humorously, but very attractive.
No.
There are a lot of 16-year-olds who would be better off than that.
Right. Yeah.
I think so.
But one of the things is that it's better off to be the child of a wealthy, neglectful parent than it is to be the child of a poor, neglectful parent.
Right.
And that's just a simple fact of life.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the best thing you can do for a child is to make sure their parents are non-poor. Mm-hmm. And you only really get exceptions to that when a kid is really just about old enough to leave home.
Yeah. Right? I work for a nonprofit that deals with at-risk youth, and I've really thought about that because there are some people who are like 15, 16, and their parents are like, for instance, there's transgender kids whose parents don't accept them and kick them out of the house, for instance. And I think, economic empowerment is like in the case where you can't make the parents accept it, then in that scenario, having a basic income would make a world of difference, not only for their economic subsistence, but also for their mental health. If you know that you have the option to leave a bad situation, then that's kind of where I see the appeal in a lot of scenarios in that respect.
Which was, on this issue of, we need a basic income for children, going to custodial parent to make sure children don't grow up poor. And I also said, you also have to do something to make sure that people aren't, that you do something about neglectful parent. But that can be abused too. We very often abuse our oversight of looking whether parents are neglectful or abusive. What we do is, if you have we really end up just punishing people for being poor. We want to think that all these poor people on benefits they're all really abusive and neglectful, and we want to have super strong punitive oversight of all these people. Then if you're wealthy and male, they're going to assume you're a good parent till proven otherwise, and they're not going to bother investigating you to find out if otherwise. And there's really no more incidents of neglectful or abusive parents at the low end of the income scale as at the high end of the income scale. Whatever you have to do, it's got to be non-punitive. It's got to be oriented for the benefit of the children, and you got to make sure that nothing you're doing is simply a proxy for punishing people for being poor. A lot of the most abusive households are some people who have a decent amount of means and have some religious excuse for why they're keeping the kids out of society. And says, these are just, good Christian people. Well, it's actually some weird cult that has very little to do with mainstream Christianity or something like that. And you can get, I've read things about kids that grew up in really horrible environments, and not just Christians, Jews, Muslims, any non-religious people, and all kinds of any walk of life. You can have somebody that's a bad parent. And what we do is the more you're from an in-group, the less we'll supervise you. And the poorer you are and the more you're from an out-group, the more we want to supervise you. And we apply that to parenting. So we got to do something to protect children, but we also got to not use that as an excuse to abuse out-group parents.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that at all. So I have kind of two related questions, and then we'll move on to stuff that's a little more fun, and then we'll close up. So basically there's another sort of objections from the left I hear a lot. One of it has to do with perhaps the most controversial property owners, which is landlords. So let's say that we put a basic income of at $2,000 a month. What's to stop landlords from simply increasing the rent by $2,000? And similarly, what's to stop an employer from pushing wages down because they say, well, you have a basic income, so why should I pay you more?
Okay, well, those are two very different questions.
Okay, we'll start with...
If the basic income is large enough for you to live on, then and employers decide that they're going to lower your wages in response to that, then you're just going to live off the basic income. Then they're reducing so you get this amount of money for whether you work or not. And then you get this much more if you work. And they're going to squeeze that. They're going to lower the differential. It'll lower the differential between what you get when you work and what you don't. That is going to give people more incentive to quit their jobs. So if your employer lowers your income in response to basic income, quit your job. Do the right thing. Quit your job. Put pressure on that. Give that employer an incentive to pay higher wages. And it's also funny that people will make the one argument, well, no one will work, and the opposite argument, well, they'll just lower wages. Those can't both be true. If people are going to work less, wages are going to go up. And and we got to make sure it's high enough so people can work less. If wages are really, if the basic income is really low, we could get the effect you're talking about. If you still need the job and you get this basic income, it is conceivable that they would lower wages in response to it. So it's got to be a high enough basic income. Okay, so that's for jobs. That's an easy one. Now, and the rent one is actually pretty easy. It's actually fairly easy too. Is that if you could create a basic income that you gave to everybody, and then you didn't increase taxes on anyone, anywhere. You just injected money in the economy. You injected $2 trillion a year, several $1 trillion a year into the economy every year without taxing any of that back. Well, then landlords would just raise their wages, but also you'd just get inflation. You cannot have an enormous program like basic income without having more taxes, or you're going to have inflation. Okay, so you're going to have some more taxes. And when you have more taxes, you're taking that money back out. You're counteracting the inflationary pressure you create by spending the basic income by the deflationary pressure you have with taxes. You have this, okay? Now you have that, and those people who pay those taxes live somewhere. They all live somewhere. The people and they pay the biggest rents. They have the biggest land value. So the land value where the people in the upper end of the income distribution, their land values are going to go down. Now, the places where poor people live, who are going to be net recipients of the basic income, their land values in those areas are going to go up. So land values where net payers live go down. Land values in places where net recipients live go up. They get closer. Now, one thing there is a bad thing that will partially counteract the advantage of the amount that you get from basic income. One thing you do about that is you can tax land values and cycle that back in basic income to cushion people from that. That's one thing you can do about it. But another thing you do is realize this is not good for landlords across the board. If you're renting to people at the upper end of the income,
then it's going the other way. So what you're also doing when you do this is you're reducing housing segregation. And housing segregation is a horrible thing. What you're now doing is making it possible for people to move to wealthier neighborhoods, for people at the upper and the lower income, upper end of the income spectrum to live closer together, redressing an enormous problem in our society. Part of the reason that we need reparations, because we're constantly channeling out groups into neighborhoods that become dangerous and become food deserts and all these things. So the effect that it has on land value is actually a very good one for society, as long as you make sure that we're looking at, well, how much is it affecting the rents in low-income areas, and can people still afford those rents on their basic income, and what other things we can do from our housing policy to make sure that housing is affordable for everyone.
That's definitely one I've thought about. I lived in Montreal for 5 years when I was doing my undergrad and master's, and the landlord situation there is just outrageous, and so it's something people think about a lot. They have rent control, so they try to make it so they can't increase the rent, but they find ways, and it's very chaotic for Montrealers. So it's just a question I had to think about. So I think now Ken has some
how do you like your Wikipedia page? I thought it was pretty good.
Oh, it's basically lifted from my BN profile.
Okay.
So of course I'm going to like it. I mean, I wrote my BN profile, and then somebody took
That's funny. I was going to ask you if you wrote it.
Pasted that and put it on Wikipedia. Well, that was nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a pretty good suspicion it was a friend of mine.
Well, that's good friend.
But I'm not going to ask. Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were wondering about academics and their Wikipedia.
They never admit to writing their own Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
That would be
but if you want to go and make changes to it, please do. Basically, just lifted from.
Oh man, and so another thing is you kind of mentioned this before, but you're bassist, just like Ken, and your birthday is the day before Ken's as well, which is
Really? Oh wow, cool.
Yeah. So do you still play bass?
I play guitar more than I play bass now. I haven't actually played bass in quite some time. What I found was when I wasn't doing music full time, well, I wasn't like in a band anymore. When I was doing music, I'd be doing it by myself. It was much better to do it as an acoustic guitar player, because somebody playing bass and singing it's without a drummer, unless you got a really good drum machine and you're an amazing bass player. It's like it's not much of a show there. But and also I don't like electric guitar without drums. And there are some really talented people who insist on doing it. I don't like their stuff. So I've been playing mostly acoustic guitar and singing. Also, not actually singing. Well, I do vocals, but I wouldn't really call it singing what I do. So that's what I still do music now, and I don't even do much of that, which is kind of disappointing, because I've written or co-written like over 100 songs in my life, and I finally got good at it, and I could also some good creative covers and stuff like that, and I miss doing it. But also, I really want to write these books. That's really the priority in my life, and I've got other competing things on my time. I've got to hold down my university professor job, which means teaching student classes and doing the service, and I'm married. That's time. You got to do
a lot of stuff.
And that has largely pushed music out of my life. I actually did somebody's birthday the other day. They had a Zoom party, and they really wanted to hear one of my songs, so I did. But I haven't done a lot of music lately. I miss it, but hopefully there'll be more of that out somewhere. But as I told you, somebody wrote a song about my theory. That's
I love that.
Now,
so what's that song called?
Okay, it has a Danish name, which I can't remember. But it keeps saying the power to say no over and over again. which is really,
That's really punk rock.
yeah.
I definitely find similar, like I'm not married or anything, but even being in grad school, I found it really hard to like stay focused on music. I think like quarantine's been the best opportunity to sort of do it again. I've always been hesitant about writing about anything political. We kind of talked about this on the podcast a few episodes ago. We had a musician on, and we were talking about how there's not a lot of, it's hard to write a good political song without it being corny.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, do you have any favorite political musicians besides this band that wrote about you?
Yeah, I've seen the English translation of the lyrics. I like it. It's not my kind of punk. I go for the more melodic punk, and they go for the more like chanting punk, you know. I like the translation of the lyrics. The stuff I've written, I've also not been able to write stuff. People have, why don't you write a song about basic income? I don't know, I have the idea. The most political thing, I did write a very political song called The Home of the Fat Homeless. Home of the Fat Homeless, Home of the Free, where if we only eat garbage, this is the land of plenty.
That's inflammatory.
That's the chorus. I haven't written a lot of stuff. So a favorite political Rancid is a big favorite band. They really come to mind. The song "Stand Your Ground," very political. The song "Salvation," about living in a homeless shelter, working for the Salvation Army, and then going into a wealthy neighborhood to pick up microwaves, refrigerators for the suffering, and being, I'm a rat. I'm a man on a mission. I'm a rat. I'm in your front yard under suspicion. Because he's like this punk guy, shows up with a mohawk and stuff, shows up to pick up people's refrigerators. That's a great political song. I like the Clash and Lou Reed. At least a lot of Celtic punk, and like the Levelers and the Pogues.
We love the Pogues on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool. And there's lots of good Celtic punk still coming out. The Dropkick Murphys. The Workers song is an amazing political song. Let's see, there's a band. Do you know the song "A Little Revolution" by Firewater?
No.
That's an amazing song. Stuff in those areas, and then like dozens of other bands and songs that I could name.
Yeah. I mean, I've been really enjoying Serj Tankian stuff lately.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he's the singer of System of a Down, but he has solo stuff, and he's Armenian. He grew up in Lebanon, which is where my family's from.
Mila, something I can't pronounce for the last.
Yeah, no one can pronounce it. That's like the anglicized version. I just say to say Garayeb, because the GH, it doesn't exist in the English language.
Is it like Harayeb?
It's like I never use that pronunciation. I just use Garayeb because I don't like to make everyone's life difficult.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. That so
my name is pronounced Clark.
Yeah.
Clarka.
It's a tough one.
Is that Clarka or Clarky?
Just Clark.
Yeah.
Clarka. Other countries where they pronounce their E's.
Yeah. I saw that you teach in Qatar.
Yeah.
Are you currently there, or you're in the States?
No, I'm in New Orleans. I was on sabbatical when this whole thing hit, but they sent people home in mid-semester, so I missed out on that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you had the option of staying, but you had to be under lockdown, or you could go home and teach from home. So I think most people went home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where I am teaching some of the most privileged people in the world. People with oil money and natural gas money and all this stuff, but also people who are impressed, some who are impressed in some way. Women in a sexist society, or men who are dealing with being a privileged Arab in a world that's built for white people, and then we get foreign students, none of which are really from a hugely disadvantaged background. we tend to get very wealthy foreign students as well. And it's a weird place. It's this really boring town that's like an imitation of LA, but you take all the counterculture stuff out of LA and you're left just with the chain restaurants. And traffic. That's like Doha.
Yeah, I mean, I know a bit of. I have some family in the Gulf, but not in Qatar. But I have some family in Bahrain, and I mean, I've never been to the Gulf. I've only been to Lebanon. But I something I really notice is that American anti-racism discourse really does not map on very well onto the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf. Like what you're saying about privileged Arabs in a world made for white people. Well, if you're a Sunni Muslim that's like wealthy in the Gulf, you're basically the white person of the Middle East. And that.
Yes, you are. Yeah, you are there. You are there, but you also have this knowledge that like America like looms over everything you do.
Yeah.
And like you go there, and the citizens have lost, but you don't. But you are a white person. You have this white citizenship. You have this American white citizenship. And there's these weird dynamics that we're just not used to.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm sure we'll reconnect at some point. And I hope that your quarantine is going well, and all that. And
it is, by the way, and hope yours is.
That's good. All right. Well, thanks so much again, and thanks to our.
Thanks again. Nice to meet you.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. Oh, hi there.
There we go.
I hope that you all enjoyed that. That was really interesting. That I learned a lot. I mean, I love to talk shit about John Locke, so. I really felt like, there was a really cool appeal to someone like me who's like an agnostic leftist about UBI, because a lot of my concerns I felt like were quite well addressed.
I can't find propertarians.com. What is it called?
It's like propertarians something. I can't remember. I was like going down a rabbit hole.
Oh, propertarianism.com.
Yeah.
No, he made a very coherent okay, well, we need to get him back on tomorrow. No.
Yeah. Yeah, and everyone
an episode a day, just like Joe.
Well, we're gonna have to start doing premium ones for the patrons because we promised them.
We should thank our patrons right now and then
wrap it. Thanks everyone for listening to the Unacceptable Podcast. This was such a cool episode to do.
You guys have to give us some thoughts about I don't know, what the fuck do we have to say for the premiers?
Nothing. It's just an extra episode.
Okay. All right.
We can just more banter.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you all we have some new patrons. And we are super, super grateful for all of you. I love this community. So thank you to Brandon, RP, GRE, Alexandra, Ivan, Sasha, and Camilo. You guys are rock stars. And if anyone else is interested in supporting the pod, you can go to patreon.com/unacceptablepodcast. And we'll have some fun things for you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mila. Thank you, Karl.
And have a good week.